Yeah, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm so thrilled to be here. And that Storytellers workshop that we did last October was so inspiring. And it was just such a great community to get together. And for me, it helped me not be so intimidated by groups like these. This is really a sharing kind of very supportive community. And so I'm just really excited to be a part of it. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about my experiences writing a book. I just published my first book last September. It is called The Age of Melt: What Glaciers, Ice Mummies, and Ancient Artifacts Teach Us About Climate, Culture, and a Future Without Ice. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. I started my career as a wildlife biologist. I studied birds all over the country. And in 2005, I landed in Yellowstone National Park. And I intended only to stay for one summer. And 20 years later, I am still here. It just has this landscape, just has that kind of hold on me and many other people, I think, who came here and only were planning on staying a summer. But I've really enjoyed my time here. So throughout my career, I've done a ton of science writing, but mostly it's been for academic and technical audiences, not so much in the creative side. And I loved it. I love that type of writing. I love doing wildlife biology, but I was also interested in branching out to the more creative side of science writing and communications. And I remember reading a short article by an archaeologist, a local archaeologist by the name of Craig Lee. And he, in 2007, had found an extremely rare and unusual object while hiking in the Beartooth Mountains, just right along the border of Montana and Wyoming. And as he was walking along the edge of this perennial patch of ice, he noticed something odd breaking the surface of the snow. And he was about 10,000 feet in elevation. So these ice patches that high are often stable, they exist year after year. So he picked up this object. It was a piece of wood. And as he describes it, his whole body began to quiver. So it's something probably you or I wouldn't, take much notice of, but to an archaeologist who's trained in seeing these sorts of things, he was able to discover or identify this object that was actually made by people. And so what it was called a hunting tool called an atlatl. And it's a tool that was used after the spear, but before the bow and arrow. So it kind of fits in that middle niche there of hunting tools. And an atlatl consists of a dart and a throwing board, and the user places the back end of the dart into a little notch on a throwing board. And so they're able to, as they extend their arms back, increase the leverage of their arm using that throwing board so that the dart will fly farther and faster. So it's a better, more effective tool than a spear alone. But what really intrigued me about this discovery was that the archaeologist had found these markings on this tool that seemed to indicate ownership. So the hunter expected to get his weapon back. They probably put a lot of effort into carving these tools, probably, decorative artwork on some of these tools. And so it would have been a prized possession that he or she would have wanted back. And so when he took a little piece of this tool and sent it off for radiocarbon dating, the results were shocking. He realized and discovered that it was 10,300 years old, and it is the oldest artifact ever to have emerged from an ice patch still to this day. And I was hooked. That was all I needed. So I just want to read for you the opening paragraph of a proposal that I wrote. So when you write a book, you write a proposal, which is sort of like an outline of what you plan to do. And this is how I described it to my agent and eventually my publisher. So in 1991, two hikers stumbled upon the frozen remains of a 5,300-year-old mummy melting out of an ice patch high in the Italian Alps. Ötzi, named after the mountain range in which he was found, was so well preserved by ice and snow that bits of brain clung to his skull, and the undigested contents of his last meal remained within his shriveled stomach. From Ötzi's tools, clothing, and Ötzi himself, scientists have reconstructed the Iceman's life, from where he was born to his last hours as the victim of a brutal murder. Ötzi's age, extraordinary preservation, and circumstances surrounding his death inspired archaeologists to climb mountain ranges around the world in search of other clues to our past, marking the beginning of a phenomenon called ice patch archaeology. But like Ötzi, these aren't just the stones and bones that archaeologists usually find. Ice patch artifacts include leather shoes and grass capes, birch bark containers and cups made of elm wood, and bows and arrows with bird feather fletching still attached. Organic artifacts like these decay in a few years if left exposed to sunlight and wind, but alpine ice and snow has kept these objects in a state of suspended animation for hundreds or even thousands of years. That is until the ice began to melt. And so I felt like that was a good description that in a couple of paragraphs kind of encapsulates all of the interesting things about ice patch archaeology, that we're dealing with a body that found in the Alps that was 5,300 years old, a murder, that these are ice patches that are containing and preserving these organic artifacts, which is not something we usually see in the archaeological record. And so that I wanted to convey all of that information in just a few paragraphs so that an agent could look at it and say, okay, I know what this book is about. And so what really interested me about ice patch archaeology is that it's interdisciplinary. So it's about climate science, culture, and history. So humans are just another species on the planet. And I really like to think about us in that way, as just another species here interacting with the environment, and thinking about how our environment has and continues to shape and influence us. And archaeologists do just that. They study our past through the material objects that we've left behind. And through these small fragments, our belongings of our ancestors, they can interpret how people lived, how they interacted with each other, and how they interacted with the environment. And so this topic for me centered people. And although that may sound egotistical, we're centering people in the story, centering people is an effective way to connect with your audience because we care about ourselves a lot. And we learn a lot about the world through the stories we tell about how we're interacting with each other and the world around us. I'll just go a little bit into my process for how I went about writing The Age of Melt. And it was, a blend of lots of research, many drafts, and kind of just trying to understand and hone a craft that I was really just developing. So to me, writing is always practice. I don't feel like you ever get to a point where you've arrived. I've arrived as a fully developed science writer, science communicator. You're always learning, and there's always something to learn, because humans are complex, and that's who we're talking to. That's who we're communicating with, is other people, and the way that other people understand things. And we need to know that in order to communicate effectively. So unless maybe you're Carl Zimmer, Ed Young, or Mary Roach, I'm willing to bet, though, that even those science writers they would say that they're still honing their craft, even though they're best-selling authors who've written many wonderful things. So the first thing I did for setting up, once I got an agent and a publisher, the first thing I did was set a Google alert for all things ice patch related. This was a huge helpful tool. I wanted to know, one, if there was enough material to write a full-length book. There's lots of great ideas for books, but if there's not enough material, then maybe it should be an article. And then I also wanted to know if people were interested in it. If I kept getting Google alerts that showed that there were lots of mentions of ice patch archaeology in the news, maybe then that would indicate to me that other people were interested in this sort of thing. And so right away, I was getting Google alerts on almost a daily basis. And so I knew that people were interested in it and that there was enough material. So I started digging into the academic literature. Because of my science background, I knew how to read academic papers and where to look for them. It can be really difficult for those of us who aren't affiliated with like a university to access some of these papers. Google Scholar is a useful source And there's also another site, which I can't remember it now, but there's some potential legality issues with that site. But basically, she fighting against the governments of our world who are keeping science, like who are gatekeeping science. And she feels that these papers should be, which I do too, made available for everyone. But I also found, if I couldn't find it anywhere, that just emailing the author, they were so happy and so responsive to send me a copy of it. So I never lacked for information. And so what I would do when I got these papers is first just read the abstract, which is sort of a high level summary. And if that seemed interesting, I would read the introduction and the discussion, because those are the places in an academic paper that the authors are going to give you some context. You don't want to dive in right away to the results and methods. Those can be really hard to read. And even if you've read and understand that particular subject really well, it can still be pretty challenging. So, just as context, I probably read 100 papers at least, and I probably read each of them 2, 3, 5 times even for some of them. So it was a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of note taking. I also relied on a lot of books about archaeology, about glaciers, and about climate change. There were no books about ice patch archaeology, so I was happy about that because that's, the niche I wanted to fill. But my intent with reading other people's books was to understand the narrative that was in existence already about those subjects. I also read some popular articles and attended a conference, and so getting my information from a variety of ways. The biggest hurdle that I ran into in the beginning was organizing it all. For a book length work, I mentioned it's hundreds of articles. There's lots of different pieces. My one piece of advice is to develop a strategy. If you're working on a big project, doesn't necessarily have to be a book length project, but a larger project is to develop a strategy for organizing your information early on and stick with it. I used a program called Zotero. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but it's free. There's a free version. You can upgrade to more storage capacity if you want to, but it's still generally pretty cheap. And it just helps you to organize sources into one place. You can store the actual article, the web pages, other materials. I found it to be a super useful tool. So if you're working on multiple projects, maybe you can have folders for each different subject or work that you're working on. And it's just a lot nicer to look at than just a bunch of folders in, your C drive or whatever, or OneDrive. And so the other thing that I really love about Zotero is that as I was drafting my book, there's an extension in Word where I could connect the literature to a particular fact. So in a book length work, I had thousands of facts, and there's no way I can remember them all or where they came from. And so in order to jog my memory and to fact check later on, it was essential for me to cite all of those pieces of information so that I could go back later and check them, because that is one of the most critical parts of science communication, is that just making sure that what you're writing is accurate. And it's a kind of amazing how, especially on a long project, how easily it can get turned around, or you can get turned around in your thinking. And so just having that reference or something to go back to is really key. So I spent about a year researching before I did much writing. I, took notes and jotted things down as I thought about them, but I really wanted to hold off on writing my first draft until I had gathered all of the research. And this is because I wanted to explore different ways to structure the material as well. And for flow, I wasn't really sure in the beginning how I was going to do that. So I already shared with you what I thought was a pretty good hook for getting an agent and a publisher, but obviously I couldn't use that same material for the opening lines of my book, because I'd be giving away everything in the first few paragraphs, and then why read the rest of the book? I've already told you all about it. So I just wanted to read for you a little bit of chapter 1, just the first couple of sentences, for how I decided to start it, which tried to create an engaging first few sentences. So, when the dead man arrived at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Innsbruck, Austria, Hans Unterdorfer saw that this was not a typical glacier corpse. Not only were all the dead man's limbs, ears, and toes intact and attached, but his body was also in a state of near perfect preservation. Most corpses found melting out of glaciers have been ravaged by the shearing force of flowing ice, limbs wrenched from sockets, flesh torn from bones, skin stretched and misshapen. Glaciers sculpt landscapes, carve valleys, and crush boulders the size of small houses. A figure as fragile as a human stands little chance of emerging whole against such power. Yet here was this almost perfectly preserved mummy, dried out like a strip of jerky, weighing only about 30 pounds. So to me, opening with the dead man right away surprises the reader. Okay, so we have a dead body. Like, what's that all about? And we're talking about glaciers. Why is there a dead body in this book? And then I finish with that sentence with Hans Unterdorfer saw that this was not a typical glacier corpse. So now the reader is going, okay, not only is there a dead body, but what is a typical glacier corpse? And if he's not one, what is an atypical glacier corpse? And why is this one different? And then I offer like a little bit of explanation, but not too much. It's mostly description of the body to kind of draw the reader in so that hopefully they will want to learn more and continue reading. So, I felt like Utsi, this 5,300-year-old mummy, was a really good a subject for the opening chapter. I mean, who doesn't love a murder mystery and a mummy? I mean, mummies are cool. So, and this was, a frozen corpse. And so anyway, I knew right away that it had to be the first chapter of my book. So once I had all of this information that I had spent a year gathering and then identified what I wanted to write about in my first chapter, my next task was figuring out how I wanted to structure the material. And for me, this was the most challenging aspect of writing. It's, writing a book length work is not simply a really long article, and it's not a series of shorter articles either. There has to be a flow throughout the book, a continuity of story through lines, but there also has to be mini stories within it that have some conclusions along the way. Otherwise, your reader will get kind of frustrated and a little bit bored. So there are lots of ways to structure a book. Chronology is probably one of the most common. By themes or thematic structure is also pretty common. I chose something that's sort of in between a thematic structure and a chronological structure. So all of these ice patch artifacts emerged, on a timeline. And what I chose to do is anchor each of the chapters on a particular object. And when that one object, or when the first object started melting out of the ice in each of those regions. And then from there, I could kind of tell a thematic story about a particular area like the Yukon, or here in the Beartooths, or Norway, about what the culture was surrounding those artifacts, what the history and the background, and a little bit about the archaeologists that are searching for these artifacts today. I wanted to talk a little bit about voice and tone. So this comes up a lot in like writing classes. If you've ever done a writing workshop or read books about writing, everyone has their own style and everyone has their own voice. And I always found like descriptions of what is your voice confusing, because it's like, it just is what it is. You can't really control that. You have a style, whether you know it or not, but it's figuring out what your style is and then maybe honing that and building on the good parts of that, of what your voice is. So at first, I thought my style was going to include a lot more personal narrative than what I ended up including. I ended up cutting entire chapters that were really, I felt like in the end, a little bit navel gazy. But that pained me a lot because I had spent so much time writing them. But in the end, you got to serve the story. And if it's just not right for it, it's just not right for it. And you got to find a different place for it. So making those hard choices about what to cut, you know when it's right. And even though it's hard, you just got to do it. And so when I went to my editor and I told her, look, I'm thinking about cutting this chapter and then merging these two other chapters, she said, "Thank you for being your own best editor," which I really loved that. I thought that was a good compliment because to me, it made me think that she also thought that that was a good choice, and that I was, taking charge of it, because I think, it could be really easy to just say, well, I'm just going to give this to my editor and she can or he can deal with it and try to cut it down. But really, it's your job as the writer to make it as concise and a compelling story as possible. The other piece of advice that writers get a lot is to show and don't tell. And basically, what this means is you don't want to just explain something. I mean, there are times, of course, when you just need to explain something and it has its place. But you want to use as much as possible action and sensory details to kind of showcase your story, so that the reader can use their imagination to visualize. And so I'll just read a little bit from to showcase an example. So this was before I was trying to figure out how scientists study ice cores that they pull from glaciers, and they were also pulling these ice cores from ice patches. And so I went to the Desert Research Institute in Reno to visit a lab there and a couple of scientists that I had met, and to figure out, what it is, how they do this. And so I wanted to set the stage for my readers to better understand what it was that I was seeing. So to find out how ice cores are processed, I visited Chelman at the Desert Research Institute one spring day. When I arrived at the lab on the second floor of DRI, Chelman was focused on one of 11 computer monitors lining a wall. Multicolored wavy lines slid by on the screen. On the opposite wall was a dizzying array of wires, tubes, and instruments that measure the concentration of elements found in the ice. Although Joe McConnell, the Ice Core Laboratory's director of research, calls it spaghetti, it's actually an impressive state-of-the-art system that McConnell designed himself. McConnell and Chelman spend much of their time studying human impacts on remote regions of Antarctica and Greenland by looking for trace elements trapped in the ice. Chelman greeted me with his usual good cheer, and after a brief bit of banter over the fact that there isn't a hotel in Reno without a casino, I was staying at the Atlantis, where my husband was busy trying his luck at the slots, he offered to show me around the lab, starting with the cold room. And so what I was trying to do there is set the stage by describing how scientists are able to look at these ice cores, but I didn't want to just go right into it. And I think it works, hopefully. You think it works too, because it provides a visual image of the spaghetti of wires of these 11 computer monitors with wavy multicolored lines. That's what I saw. And then as I learned and asked them questions, I was able to tell the reader what those wavy lines were, what that spaghetti of wires was actually doing. And so it helps to get the reader ready to take in more complex information that might be unfamiliar to them. And I continued that throughout that section without hopefully sacrificing any detail. And I will say that what I did for all of the people that I interviewed is I took the final, what I hoped would be the final draft of sections of the book, and I sent it out to everyone that I interviewed, because I wanted to make sure that nothing was lost in translation as I tried to tell the story in a compelling way. I think it could be really easy for you to understand something when you're there in person and there's a scientist talking to you, but then you go home later and you're like, but I want to add all these other details in. And so I just wanted to make sure. And I did have mistakes in there that they were able to fix. And so I'm super grateful to that. I think I'll just, one or two more things here. I spent a lot of time. So the worst thing is, the blank page. You hear that a lot, and it definitely is really daunting to say, I'm going to write this story about this, and just be staring at your computer screen or your notebook and going, well, what do I write next? Or what do I write now? And my advice is just to start writing anything, a free write. And it's probably going to be really shitty. It's probably going to be terrible, but there might also be really great nuggets in there. And you kind of need to get out that first draft. You need to throw up on the page a little bit and then come back to it. And it's so much easier when you have, even if it's terrible, something to work with. So that would be, I think, another piece of advice that I found really helpful is just to start writing. You just got to start. And then also building a community like this one. I had probably not as big a community as I would have liked, and partly because writing is often a very like solo endeavor, and writing a book, I got very kind of into my own world, and I wish that I had reached out to people more. So that would be one thing that I wish I had done a little bit differently. But in the end, it all worked out, and I had lots of people end up reading it later on in the process. So feedback from trusted professionals. And the other thing I would say is that you want to choose your readers very carefully. I sent it to a good friend of mine, and she's a wonderful person, but it was the wrong person to send it to. She's just not, she reads a ton, but she's just, it wasn't, and it's nothing to do with her, but it kind of, it's getting feedback from your friends like that can be very difficult. And so I would just say choose wisely. Yeah, that was a little bit about my process for writing this book. And I think I'll stop there and open it up and see if anybody has any questions.
Lisa, I'm really curious. You kind of mentioned how you really were able to center a lot of your storytelling around people and like the human element. And I was wondering if you could dive into that a little bit more when it comes to trying to communicate science. What are some ways that you consciously thought about bringing the people to the front of the story rather than just having it be the numbers and the data and the analytics of the science?
There are people are doing the science, right? Science isn't just happening, and it's not just, these numbers aren't just getting out there. When you read an academic paper, it's very like passive voice, and there's nobody doing anything. If you've ever read a scientific paper, you know that. So it kind of, they purposefully try to remove the person. And so I think putting the person back in is really key. And the way that I did that was just to be out in the field with them, to visit them in some of the spaces that they feel most comfortable, and just to have regular conversations with them and treat them like, I mean, they're just people like you or I. But it can be intimidating to talk to someone who's like a PhD from Harvard, who does all this cool work on glaciers in Antarctica and is, gets all these National Science Foundation grants. But there's always something to bond over. So one of the scientists, I mean, and I'm talking about a specific person here, he and I bonded over birds, and I just was not expecting that. And I am a former, ornithologist. I studied birds, and so we had that in common to kind of like break the ice, and maybe even include a detail like that if it fits in with the story. So another example of that is one of his colleagues was surveying an ice patch, and he had this big, huge piece of equipment that he was, and ice patches are kind of like on a huge slope. So they're really hard to walk around on, and they're slippery, of course, because they're all icy. But he was trying to get measurements of inside the ice by sending pulses of energy down through the ice that would bounce back and then give him kind of this map of what the ice patch looked like. But he was using this teal green sled that he had used as a child. And I thought that was such a great detail to include in the book because it fit in with the story. I was trying to explain to readers what he was doing with this big piece of equipment, doing this complex mapping of this ice, but he was using his childhood sled to do it. And so it's a small detail. You don't need a lot. You don't need whole paragraphs, but one detail here and there, anytime that you bring a person into the story I think is helpful, kind of helps the reader create a picture.
Lisa, while you're talking, I already requested your book on interlibrary loan because I got so excited. Anyway, I'm interested in learning a little bit more detail about the logistics of the beginning of your process. I don't know anything about books and publishers and agents, and I was very interested to hear that, well, first, that your proposal seemed to only be a couple paragraphs, and maybe I misunderstood that. But then the second was that you sent the proposal and had it accepted by an agent or a publisher, and then you decided that it was going to be a book or an article. So if you could just speak to the beginning of that process and the logistics of that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I think I may have misspoke a little bit about that because before I wrote the proposal, I knew that there was enough material. I had done enough research to know that there was enough for a book and that I was interested enough in the material that I could sustain that for years to write it. And the proposal, I just read a couple of paragraphs. That was a summary of the book, but the proposal is very comprehensive. It includes not only a summary of the book, but also a sample chapter.
Okay.
And if you're writing a nonfiction book, sample chapter, it includes each of the chapters, a summary of each chapter that you plan to include. It includes a whole marketing plan. What do you plan? How do you plan to promote your book? It also includes a bio about you and why you're the right person to write this book. And then there's a section for comps or competitive books. So you gather information about all of the books that are similar to yours, or maybe even on the same subject, and write about why yours is different from those. And I use this awesome book called, and I can send it later, but it's writing a nonfiction book proposal. And it's a step-by-step guide, and it's wonderful. And that's what I use to write it. And then the second part of your question, did I answer fully or? Okay.
Yeah, I can't actually remember what the second part was, but those were all the things that were on my mind. One quick follow-up question. Once your proposal was accepted by the publisher, did you get enough funding so that your writing was your full-time position, or were you splitting your time between this and your full-time job?
Well, the short answer to that is no, I did not get enough money. I was given a small advance, and I'll just say it, $10,000 advance. And if I had to do it over, I might not take an advance at all, because what happens is so now that my book's out there in the world, they're trying to recoup their money. So I don't make any money off the book until they make their $10,000 back.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And of course, I spent a couple of years writing this book by the time I ended up leaving my other job. And I ended up leaving my other job. And it was actually the contract I was working on had ended. So it was fortuitous. And I just was like, okay, well, I'm not going to look for another job. I'm going to be a writer. I was lucky enough to have a spouse who has a full-time job, who has health insurance, and I had saved money so that I could still be a contributing member of my family and not relying solely on his income. But honestly, it's a privilege to be able to write a book. It's economically not a sound decision. I would say so think carefully.
How did you find the right people to review your draft?
Okay, yeah. So I started out by saying that I ended up tapping a couple of acquaintances of mine who I'm friendly with, but I don't hang out. They're not best friends or whatever, they're great people. But one of them was an English teacher at high school here, and she's an avid reader. And I was just like, that's the kind of person who I think would be able to have enough distance from me, from who I am, to be able to read the page and just give me her straight up edits and comments about what she thinks could be different. Another person was also an acquaintance, and she is a fire ecologist, so she has a science background, and that's why I chose her, because she has a science background, but it's not in archaeology, it's not in climate change, but she knows enough. And because I'm writing a book for people who may not be experts in this stuff, right? And they're just curious and but they're smart. So that's why I chose her. And they ended up being fabulous, providing really great, concrete feedback that I could then take and use. And, it's your choice in the end, whether you decide to take that feedback or not.
Thank you, Lisa.
I kind of just had a similar question to the beginning of your process, and wondering how you found an agent and then a publisher and sort of those next steps.
Yeah. I found my agent. So I went to a conference, a writers conference, and there was a pitch fest, and I went around pitching my book to agents, and it's like Flash, it's speed dating for writers and agents. And I got a couple of cards from that. Nobody there ended up being my agent, but it gave me the confidence to kind of I reached out to another writer friend of mine who lives locally, and I just told her how much I liked her book, and we just traded, stories a little bit. And she's like, you know what? I love what you're working on. I think my agent would be really good for you. And so she connected us together, and that's how I got my agent. And then my agent, once we worked on the proposal to polish it, she sent it off to publishers. And I ended up, she sent it to a bunch of publishers, and two of them wanted it, which I felt really grateful for. And I ended up going with a small press in Oregon.
So you've been through this whole process of writing a book, but I think you said kind of at the beginning of your talk that you're always, we're always developing as writers, we're always growing. I'm kind of curious, your role with the Northern Great Plains joint venture now, how are you bringing some of what you've learned during this process of writing a book into your current work? And maybe, I don't know, are you looking for another topic to write a book on, or what are some of the ways where you're staying engaged with science writing?
So I work for the Northern Great Plains joint venture as a communication specialist. And one of the ways I've been with them for just about a year now, a year on like Monday. So in the past year, I've just been learning my job, but also I wrote a profile of a family ranch that in Eastern Montana that was included in our e-newsletter. And so that's going to be a new series. And that's one of the ways that I'm bringing my experience into it, is by highlighting those families and all of the, and it's, just all of the interviewing skills I did, and just being out there and remembering that you want to write down those details of how the sun felt, or whether it was windy or you got dust in your eyes, all the things that you experience when you're out on a family ranch, and writing those details down and bringing that into a story. So I've only done one so far, but I plan to do a whole series of them. And I see in the chat that Alex had Sci-Hub. That's the one that you can get a lot of articles, scientific publications that aren't available elsewhere. I think it's a great resource.
Thanks for throwing that in the chat, Alex.
I'm curious if we've got anybody kind of with us today in the room that feels like they have some science storytelling tips and tricks to add in here. We can kind of open it up for a group discussion. And if nobody's got any science writing stuff, we can switch to more general storytelling challenges or things people are facing. But for now, do we have any other like science communicators in the room who are relating with anything that Lisa is saying? Julia, I see you raising your hand.
Hopping and Julia Devis with Working Lands for Wildlife. I liked what you said about like science isn't happening, like science are doing it. And one of the ones I remember, Emily, is actually one of the ones that the IWJV put out that had a picture of a farmer holding a spatial map on the landscape that was on the map. And I thought that was such a cool way, so that it wasn't just a flat map, but it like brought a person into it, and it brought the landscape into it. And I still like, that's still one of my favorite things that I've seen, like when you've got maps or something, like we like maps, we like talking about maps. But if you've got a photo up like that on a back of a four-wheeler or pickup truck or something, that like the map in the context of it, that was just such a really cool visual.
I have a question building on that, because when I go out in the field with these collaborative groups, and with a bunch of stakeholders doing a site visit, I get a bunch of pictures of a group of people like standing around in a circle talking with each other. And like, does anyone have any suggestions of how I could take that kind of experience and make it look more engaging in a photo? Like what should I be focusing on when I'm doing these like field visits with stakeholder groups?
I'll completely admit that I stage photos. So if somebody's got some sort of like a handbook or a pocket guide or something, I'm like, hey, could the two of you just like pretend you're looking at this like in here, or like on the hood of this pickup truck, like So I will fully admit to grabbing a couple of people and staging it.
We for sure do the same thing. Julia will like have people walk through like grass in a certain way, or like get down and examine a fence, or like Hannah, our colleague that's not here today, she's notorious for making people pick up sage grouse poop and hold it in their hands and show, like show it to the camera. So just what are some ways where you can have people interact with the environment? Because yeah, I feel you on those standing in circle photos. They're real hard to get away from.
Just one comment on those circle pictures, and then I had a question for Lisa too, if that's all right. The trick I found was to give them something to do more than the talking and the sharing. Like, here's why we're here. So we had one. You're gonna love this, Lisa. We had it was a forest collaborative come together, but we were also with the Audubon Society doing birding. So we were doing bird counts and talking about forestry and how they relate, and everyone was doing the bird count. So it was really easy to get some awesome photos of people looking at birds and using the Merlin app and stuff like that. So that was just one thing, and I'm trying to do that more and more. Like, we have an activity. It's not just talking in the woods. We have an activity in the woods too. Lisa, I wanted to ask, which you seem to have captured really well, this like journalistics, maybe inspired by fiction, maybe other ways of storytelling. And I was wondering what inspired you to tell the story the way you did, and did you make use of journalism that you like and fiction that you like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wanted to tell the story like I was discovering it, like because I was discovering it as I went along and read these papers, and it wasn't, obviously I didn't come across these papers in the order that I ended up, writing about in the book, but it was sort of, yeah, I tried to really tie it to like how this field of ice patch archaeology developed over time, and just make it so that the reader was on that journey with me. Like, they were discovering this story of ice patch archaeology over time and how it developed. And so I did try to use some fictional storytelling techniques, especially when it comes to the recreation, how scientists have tried to recreate what the last few days of Ötzi's life were like. And I write about this in the book, and it's really fascinating how they were able to go into his body and like figure out what he ate and when he ate it, and given human anatomy and how long it takes to digest things, and then also pollen in the atmosphere, because he died in spring, so there was lots of pollen around. But different plants live at different elevations, so he was incorporating these different pollens in his diet based on where he was in elevation up and down the mountain. And so based on all of that, scientists were able to kind of piece together a story of his last like 72 hours. And so they wrote about that in a scientific paper, and I took that and wrote it in more storytelling form. And I did that for two. There's another mummy that the same sort of thing had happened to. So that's a little bit of how I try to bring in some fictional elements.
In the chat, Karen asks, Lisa, can you share the proposal template that you mentioned?
Thanks for coming, everybody. We will be back next month, same time. This 3 p.m. time slot seems to work well for a lot of folks. So we'll see you on February 27th at 3 p.m. and Carrie will be our presenter. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Lisa, for your presentation today.
Mm-hmm.